The marble floors of the Grand Meridian Hotel gleamed under crystal chandeliers as reporters adjusted their cameras and sound equipment. Marcus Blackwood, CEO of Blackwood Industries, was about to announce the largest real estate acquisition in Manhattan's history. The press conference would cement his reputation as the city's most ruthless developer, a man who transformed neighborhoods into profit margins without looking back. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus straightened his platinum cufflinks, surveying the sea of media representatives from behind the mahogany podium. At 47, he commanded respect through sheer presence, 6 feet of calculated authority wrapped in a $10,000 Italian suit. His steel-gray eyes had intimidated countless boardroom opponents, and today would be no different. The acquisition of Riverside Gardens, a low-income housing complex, would be demolished within months to make way for luxury condominiums. 300 families would be displaced, but Marcus had learned long ago that sentiment was the enemy of success. Progress demanded sacrifice, and he was simply the instrument of progress. The October morning carried Manhattan's familiar symphony of ambition, honking taxis, clicking heels on concrete, and the distant hum of construction reshaping the city's skyline. Marcus Blackwood stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office on the 52nd floor, watching miniature people navigate the streets below like pieces on a chessboard he controlled. His reflection stared back from the glass, revealing a man who had transformed himself through pure will. The son of a struggling mechanic from Queens had become Manhattan's most feared real estate mogul, accumulating wealth that would have seemed impossible in his childhood. Every gray hair at his temples represented another victory, another property acquired, another competitor eliminated. Sarah Chen, his executive assistant, entered with military precision, her heels announcing her approach across the polished marble. She carried the morning briefings in a leather portfolio that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Mr. Blackwood, the press conference is confirmed for 11:30. All major outlets will be present, including the Times, the Post, and 3 television networks. The acquisition papers for Riverside Gardens are ready for your signature following the announcement. Marcus turned from the window, his attention shifting to the mahogany desk where architectural renderings displayed his vision for the future. Where Riverside Gardens currently housed 300 low-income families, gleaming towers would rise, 30 stories into the sky, each unit selling for millions to Manhattan's elite. The financing package was an art form in itself. Marcus had structured the deal through a web of shell companies and offshore accounts that would minimize tax liability while maximizing returns. The displaced families would receive minimal relocation assistance, just enough to satisfy legal requirements while ensuring they couldn't afford to remain in the neighborhood. "Any complications with the residents?" Marcus asked, reviewing the final contracts. Sarah consulted her tablet with practiced efficiency. "The tenant association has retained legal counsel, but their resources are limited. Most families are already searching for alternative housing, though finding affordable options in the city has proven challenging." Marcus nodded with satisfaction. Market forces worked exactly as intended. Those who couldn't adapt would be eliminated, making room for those who could pay premium prices. He had learned this lesson early in his career, watching his own father struggle to maintain a small auto repair shop as corporate chains moved into their neighborhood. The difference was that Marcus had chosen to become the corporation rather than its victim. He'd studied the game, mastered its rules, and now wrote those rules for others to follow. Sentiment was a luxury he couldn't afford, and success required making difficult decisions that weaker individuals avoided. His phone displayed a text message from Diana, his sister and chief financial officer. The final environmental impact report had been approved despite objections from community groups. Construction could begin within 60 days of the acquisitions. Completion, putting them ahead of schedule for spring groundbreaking. Marcus smiled at his reflection in the darkened phone screen. Diana had proven invaluable in navigating the complex regulatory landscape that governed Manhattan development. Her background in environmental law provided legitimacy to projects that might otherwise face stronger opposition. She understood that sometimes the greater good required short-term sacrifice from those least able to resist. The intercom buzzed, with Sarah's voice. "Mr. Blackwood, your car is ready for departure to the press conference. Security has cleared the route, and preliminary media setup is complete." Marcus gathered the signed contracts, sliding them into a briefcase that had accompanied him to countless similar announcements. Each acquisition followed the same pattern: identify undervalued properties, pressure current owners through legal and financial mechanisms, acquire at below-market prices, and redevelop for maximum profit. Riverside Gardens represented the culmination of a 3-year strategy. The housing complex sat on prime Manhattan real estate, its aging buildings housing families who had lived there for generations. Their roots ran deep, but roots could be severed when necessary. Progress demanded it. The elevator descended through 52 floors of Blackwood Industries' empire. Each floor housed different divisions of his business: real estate development, property management, construction, and financial services. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What had begun as a single real estate transaction 15 years ago had evolved into a vertically integrated machine that dominated Manhattan's development landscape. Marcus reviewed his talking points during the brief elevator ride. The press conference would emphasize job creation, increased tax revenue, and Manhattan's continued evolution as a world-class city. The economic benefits would outweigh any temporary inconvenience to current residents, who would benefit from improved neighborhood amenities and increased property values. The human cost rarely appeared in these calculations. Families displaced, communities scattered, elderly residents forced to leave neighborhoods they'd called home for decades. Marcus had trained himself not to see these consequences, focusing instead on spreadsheets and profit margins that provided cleaner metrics for success. His black Bentley waited at the building's entrance, engine running, driver standing at attention. Beside the open rear door, Marcus settled into leather seats that cost more than most people's annual salaries. His briefcase positioned beside him, containing the contracts that would reshape another piece of Manhattan. The drive to the Grand Meridian Hotel took 18 minutes through traffic that parted before his driver's expert navigation. Marcus used the time to review his speech, ensuring every word was calculated to project confidence and inevitability. Opposition would be acknowledged, but dismissed as the inevitable resistance that accompanied necessary progress. During the ride, he reflected on the path that had brought him to this moment. The son of working-class parents who had struggled to pay rent each month, watching helplessly as their neighborhood gentrified around them. His father's auto shop had been demolished to make way for a luxury apartment complex, forcing the family to relocate to a smaller apartment in a less desirable area. That experience had taught Marcus a crucial lesson. Power belonged to those who accumulated enough resources to shape circumstances rather than merely react to them. He had sworn never to be powerless again, channeling his determination into academic excellence, then business success, and finally the kind of wealth that rendered him immune to the forces that had destroyed his family's stability. The Grand Meridian Hotel rose before them, its limestone facade representing old Manhattan money and established power. Marcus had chosen this venue deliberately, its reputation lending gravitas to announcements that might seem merely mercenary. in less elegant surroundings. The hotel's ballroom had hosted decades of similar press conferences where fortunes were made and neighborhoods transformed. Security personnel guided the Bentley to a private entrance where Marcus could avoid any potential protesters who might have gathered at the main doors. His team had learned to anticipate opposition, though legal injunctions and private security usually contained any disruptions before they could gain media attention. Marcus entered through a marble-lined corridor that led directly to the hotel's executive level. The press conference would take place in the Wellington Ballroom, a space designed to project authority and success. Crystal chandeliers, gold-leafed moldings, and Persian rugs created an atmosphere where million-dollar announcements seemed routine rather than extraordinary. The ballroom buzzed with pre-conference activity as reporters tested equipment and camera operators adjusted their angles. Marcus recognized several familiar faces: financial journalists who had covered his previous acquisitions, real estate reporters who understood the industry's dynamics, and television personalities who would translate his announcement into digestible segments for evening news broadcasts. Diana waited near the podium, her presence adding credibility to the environmental aspects of the project. As Blackwood Industries' chief financial officer, she had crafted the financial structure that made the acquisition possible while ensuring maximum tax efficiency. A Harvard MBA and environmental law degree provided impressive credentials that deflected criticism about the project's social impact. Marcus, she greeted him with a smile that conveyed confidence and control. Media turnout exceeded expectations. The announcement should generate significant positive coverage, particularly the job creation and tax revenue angles. Marcus nodded, surveying the assembled press corps with satisfaction. The story would dominate local business news, potentially influencing stock prices and attracting additional investment opportunities. Success built upon itself, each victory creating momentum for the next acquisition. The podium stood ready, with microphones from multiple news outlets, their corporate logos representing the media machine that would carry his message throughout the region. Behind the podium, architectural renderings displayed his vision for the redeveloped site, gleaming towers rising against a digital blue sky, surrounded by manicured gardens and luxury amenities that bore no resemblance to the current housing complex. Sarah approached with final details. All contracts are prepared for signing. Security has confirmed the venue is clear, and we're ready to begin on your signal. The estimated duration is 20 minutes for the announcement and 15 minutes for questions. Marcus checked his watch, noting they were precisely on schedule. Punctuality projected competence, and competence generated confidence among investors and media representatives who would shape public perception of the acquisition. Every detail had been calculated to create an atmosphere of inevitable success. The audience had settled into their seats. Cameras were positioned and focused, and the ambient lighting had been adjusted to ensure optimal visual quality for television broadcasts. Marcus straightened his tie, gathered his notes, and prepared to step behind the podium where he would announce another victory in his campaign to reshape Manhattan according to his vision. He moved toward the podium with the confident stride that had intimidated countless opponents, his mind focused on the talking points that would frame the acquisition as beneficial for all stakeholders. The displacement of 300 families would be presented as an opportunity for neighborhood improvement, their sacrifice serving the greater good of economic development and urban progress. Marcus reached the podium and surveyed the assembled media representatives, his steel gray eyes meeting cameras that would carry his message to thousands of viewers. This moment represented the culmination of months of planning, negotiation, and strategic maneuvering that had brought Riverside Gardens within his grasp. "Good morning," he began, his voice carrying the authority that came from absolute confidence in his position. "Today marks another significant milestone in Manhattan's continued evolution as we announce the acquisition of Riverside Gardens and our plans for transformative redevelopment that will benefit our entire community. The familiar rhythm of corporate presentation settled over him as Marcus outlined the financial benefits, job creation potential, and long-term economic impact of replacing aging housing with modern luxury development. He had delivered similar speeches dozens of times, each announcement following the same pattern of projecting inevitability while minimizing opposition. Behind him, the architectural renderings glowed under spotlights, their digital perfection, erasing any trace of the families who currently called Riverside Gardens home. The future Marcus described contained no mention of displacement, no acknowledgement of the human cost, no recognition that progress often came at the expense of those least able to defend themselves. The press conference was proceeding exactly as planned when Marcus noticed movement at the ballroom's rear entrance. Security should have prevented any unauthorized access, but a small figure had somehow entered the controlled environment. The interruption was minor, barely visible from the podium, and Marcus continued his presentation without breaking rhythm. However, as the figure moved closer, Marcus realized it was a child, a young girl who couldn't have been more than 10 years old. She wore a simple blue dress that looked carefully maintained despite obvious age, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail that suggested hurried preparation. Most concerning was her determined expression as she walked directly toward the podium, ignoring security personnel who had begun moving to intercept her. Marcus paused mid-sentence, his attention drawn to this unexpected disruption. The child carried something in her small hand, a folded piece of paper that she clutched with obvious importance. Cameras began turning toward the girl, sensing that something unscripted was about to unfold in what should have been a carefully controlled corporate announcement. Security guards moved to remove the child, but she ducked under their reaching arms with surprising agility, continuing her advance toward the podium. Her eyes were fixed on Marcus with an intensity that seemed impossible for someone so young, as if she carried a message of vital importance that couldn't wait for proper channels or adult permission. The girl reached the foot of the podium before security could intercept her, and she held up the folded paper toward Marcus. Her voice carried across the ballroom with startling clarity, cutting through the corporate atmosphere like a blade through silk. "Mr. Blackwood," she called out, her young voice somehow commanding attention despite the chaos erupting around her. "I have something you need to see. Something about your daughter." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow, stopping his heart for a terrifying moment. Daughter. He had no daughter, had never had children. The statement made no sense, yet something in the child's expression suggested she possessed knowledge that could shatter his carefully constructed world. Marcus stared down at the girl, his mind racing, through possibilities and explanations that didn't exist. The press conference had become secondary to this moment of impossible recognition, this confrontation with a truth that couldn't possibly be true, yet somehow demanded acknowledgement. The child extended the paper toward him again, her small hand, trembling slightly, but her resolve unwavering. Whatever was written on that folded note had the power to change everything, and Marcus found himself reaching toward it, despite every instinct that warned him to maintain distance from this disruption. The ballroom had fallen silent, except for the soft whirring of cameras, capturing every moment of the unexpected drama. Marcus felt the weight of dozens of eyes watching his response to this impossible situation, knowing that his next decision would define not just the press conference, but potentially his entire future. His hand closed around the paper, and he unfolded it with fingers that had suddenly developed a tremor he couldn't control. The handwriting was childish but legible, and the words it contained would prove that everything Marcus Blackwood believed about his life was built on a foundation of lies. The note contained just a few lines, but they were enough to bring his world crashing down around him. As Marcus read the words, his face drained of color and his knees nearly buckled beneath the weight of a revelation that would change everything he thought he knew about himself and the choices that had defined his success. Without another word to the assembled press corps, Marcus Blackwood stepped away from the podium and walked out of the ballroom, leaving behind the acquisition that had consumed months of his life and the carefully planned announcement that was supposed to cement his legacy as Manhattan's most successful developer. The child watched him go, her mission accomplished, carrying secrets that would soon unravel a decade of deception and force Marcus to confront the true cost of the empire he had built on other people's lives. The elevator doors closed behind Marcus with a soft chime that seemed to echo in his chest like a funeral bell. His reflection stared back from the polished steel, showing a man whose world had just shifted on its axis. The folded note remained clutched in his trembling hand, its simple words burning in his memory like a brand. Your daughter Emma lives at Riverside Gardens, apartment 4B. She's been waiting for you to come home. The elevator descended in silence, while Marcus's mind reeled through impossible calculations. Emma, he had no daughter named Emma, had no daughter at all. The medical records from his marriage to Catherine 15 years ago had been definitive. A childhood illness had left him sterile, unable to father children. It was one reason their marriage had eventually crumbled, the weight of that disappointment, driving them apart until divorce became inevitable. Yet the child's eyes had held such certainty, such conviction, that she possessed knowledge he desperately needed. And Riverside Gardens, the same housing complex he was about to demolish, displacing 300 families without a second thought. The coincidence was too precise to be accidental. Marcus exited into the hotel's marble lobby, his footsteps echoing hollow against the polished stone. Staff members and guests moved around him with purposeful efficiency, unaware that his carefully constructed reality was dissolving with each passing moment. The press conference he'd abandoned would generate its own headlines now, but none of that mattered compared to the revelation burning in his pocket. His driver waited outside, engine running, ready to return to Blackwood Industries, where dozens of employees were expecting him to sign the final Riverside Gardens contracts. Instead, Marcus gave an address that surprised even himself. "Take me to Riverside Gardens, Building 4. The driver's eyebrows raised slightly in the rearview mirror. "Sir, that's in the Lower East Side. The area's been designated for redevelopment." "I'm aware of the designation," Marcus replied tersely. "Just drive." The Bentley pulled away from the Grand Meridian Hotel, leaving behind the world of corporate announcements and calculated presentations. As they drove through Manhattan's shifting neighborhoods, Marcus watched the city transform from polished prosperity to working-class survival. Glass towers gave way to brick apartments, designer boutiques yielded to corner markets, and the manicured perfection of Midtown dissolved into the authentic chaos of communities fighting to preserve their place in an increasingly expensive city. Marcus had made this journey countless times in reverse, metaphorically speaking. His entire career had been built on identifying neighborhoods like this one, areas where gentrification could transform modest investments into massive profits. He had developed an instinct for recognizing vulnerability, for sensing when communities lacked the resources to resist change. Riverside Gardens occupied 6 blocks of what had once been prime waterfront property before industrial development pushed residential areas inland. The housing complex consisted of 12 buildings, each containing 30 apartments that housed families spanning multiple generations. Many residents had lived there for decades, their children growing up in the same hallways where their parents had played. The buildings showed their age, but retained structural integrity that would last decades longer with proper maintenance. Unfortunately, proper maintenance didn't serve Marcus's acquisition strategy. He had spent 2 years, systematically, undermining the complex through code violations, maintenance delays, and strategic pressure on utility providers. Each problem he created gave him additional leverage to argue that demolition was the only economically viable solution. Building 4 stood at the complex's center, its red brick facade weathered but dignified. Children played in the small courtyard, between buildings, their laughter carrying across the space despite the uncertainty hanging over their homes. Marcus had seen similar scenes countless times during site visits, but he had trained himself to view them as temporary obstacles rather than human realities. Now, staring at those same children through tinted windows, Marcus wondered if one of them might be the daughter he never knew existed. The possibility seemed impossible, yet the girl's conviction at the press conference had shaken his certainty about everything he thought he knew about his own life. Marcus instructed his driver to wait and approached Building 4 with hesitation that felt foreign to his usual decisive nature. The lobby was clean but worn, its linoleum floors and fluorescent lighting reflecting the kind of functional design that prioritized necessity over aesthetics. A bulletin board near the mailboxes displayed community notices, children's artwork, and announcements about tenant meetings discussing the pending eviction. Apartment 4B sat on the 4th floor, accessible through an elevator that wheezed and groaned with age, but functioned adequately. Marcus rode upward in mechanical silence, each floor bringing him closer to answers he wasn't certain he wanted to discover. The hallway was quiet, except for muffled sounds of daily life filtering through thin walls. Television programs, cooking preparations, conversations in multiple languages that reflected the complex's diverse population. Marcus stood before the marked 4B, his hand raised to knock, but frozen by uncertainty. What if the child had been mistaken? What if this was some elaborate scheme designed to exploit his wealth or damage his reputation? What if, worst of all, she had been telling the truth? Before he could knock, the door opened to reveal a woman, approximately his own age, her dark hair streaked with premature gray and her brown eyes widening with shock as she recognized him. She wore scrubs that suggested medical employment, and her exhausted expression spoke to someone juggling multiple responsibilities while fighting to maintain stability. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What are you doing here?" The woman knew his name, knew his face, knew enough to be surprised by his presence. Marcus found his voice after a moment of stunned silence. "I received a message about a daughter, about Emma." "Are you her mother?" The woman's face cycled through multiple emotions: surprise, fear, anger, and something that might have been hope. She glanced down the hallway, as if checking for observers, then stepped aside to allow him entry. "My name is Maria Santos," she said, as Marcus entered the modest apartment. "Emma is my daughter, our daughter." The simple statement hit Marcus like a physical blow. Our daughter. The words implied a relationship, a history, a connection that his memory couldn't process. Maria Santos was not Catherine, his ex-wife. He had no recollection of any relationship with this woman, no memory of circumstances that could have resulted in a child. "I don't understand," Marcus said, his usual corporate confidence replaced by confusion and growing panic. "I don't remember you. I don't remember any relationship that could have resulted in a daughter." Maria's expression hardened with pain that had obviously festered for years. "Of course you don't remember. Why would someone like you remember someone like me?" She gestured for him to sit on a modest couch that had seen better years but remained clean and comfortable. The apartment was small but well maintained, decorated with children's artwork and family photographs that showed Maria with a young girl who possessed startling blue eyes that seemed familiar despite their impossible presence. 15 years ago, Maria began, her voice steady despite the emotion behind her words. "I worked as a night janitor in your office building. Blackwood Industries was just getting started, and you were working late every night, building your empire one deal at a time." Marcus searched his memory for any recollection of a cleaning woman from those early years. The building had employed dozens of maintenance staff, most of whom remained invisible to the executives focused on business development. He had prided himself on his dedication, often working until dawn on acquisitions and negotiations that required absolute attention. "I was putting myself through nursing school," Maria continued, "working 3 jobs to pay tuition while caring for my sick mother. The night shift at your building was my best-paying job, even though it meant sleeping only a few hours each day between classes and my other work." A vague memory began forming in Marcus's mind. Late nights in the office, someone bringing coffee during extended work sessions, brief conversations about nothing important. The memory was hazy, filtered through years of similar interactions with service personnel who had been part of the background of his professional life. "We talked sometimes," Maria said, watching his face for signs of recognition. "You were going through your divorce, working constantly to avoid dealing with personal problems. I was exhausted from carrying too many responsibilities. We were both lonely people trying to survive in a city that demands everything from those who have nothing to give." The memory crystallized with uncomfortable clarity. Maria had been kind during those late nights, offering encouragement during the worst period of his marriage's dissolution. Her presence had been a rare source of human warmth during months when his personal life was crumbling, while his professional success accelerated. One night, Maria continued, "You received news that your divorce was final. You were devastated. Despite having initiated the proceedings, I found you in your office, surrounded by legal documents and empty bottles, completely broken by the realization that your marriage was over." Marcus remembered that night with painful clarity now. The lawyers had called with final confirmation that all assets had been divided, all connections severed, all hope for reconciliation eliminated. Catherine had taken half his accumulated wealth and disappeared from his life forever, leaving him alone in an office that suddenly felt like a monument to professional success and personal failure. "You asked me to stay," Maria said quietly. "Said you couldn't bear to be alone with the realization that you had destroyed the only relationship that mattered. I should have left, should have maintained professional boundaries, but you seemed so lost, so genuinely broken." The night came flooding back now. Maria's compassion in the face of his vulnerability, her willingness to listen while he processed the end of his marriage, the gradual progression from conversation to comfort to intimacy that neither of them had planned but both desperately needed. It had been a single night, a moment of human connection in the midst of isolation that felt like it might consume him. The next morning, Marcus continued the memory himself. "I was mortified by my unprofessional behavior. I avoided you for weeks, and when I did see you, I acted like nothing had happened." Maria nodded with bitter understanding. "You were building your empire, and I was just the cleaning woman who had served a temporary purpose. I finished my shift that morning knowing I would never speak to you about what happened, knowing you would pretend it meant nothing. But it had meant something," Marcus realized with growing horror. It had resulted in a daughter he never knew existed, a child who had grown up without her father, while he accumulated wealth and power that could have transformed her life. "I discovered the pregnancy 6 weeks later," Maria continued. "By then, your secretary had been instructed to screen all calls and visitors. I left messages that were never returned, sent letters that were never answered. I even tried waiting outside your building, but security removed me as a potential threat." Marcus closed his eyes, remembering the protocols Diana had implemented. to protect his privacy and maintain professional boundaries. No unauthorized contact, no personal interruptions, no distractions from the business focus that had driven his success. Maria's attempts to contact him had been filtered out as efficiently as any other unwanted intrusion. "I was working 3 jobs and attending nursing school while pregnant," Maria said. "When Emma was born, I had to drop out of school and focus on providing for her. The medical bills from complications during delivery consumed my savings, and I eventually lost my other jobs because childcare was impossible to arrange." The cascade of consequences unfolded with devastating logic. Marcus's rejection had forced Maria into financial desperation that spiraled into the kind of poverty he had spent his entire life trying to escape. While he accumulated millions, his daughter had grown up in exactly the circumstances he had once feared for himself. "Why didn't you pursue child support?" Marcus asked. "Legal action to establish paternity and financial responsibility." Maria's laugh held no humor. "With what resources, Mr. Blackwood? You had lawyers and money and connections. I had a baby and minimum wage jobs and no family support. The legal system serves people who can afford to access it." Emma chose that moment to enter the apartment. Home from school, with a backpack slung over her shoulder and curiosity lighting her distinctive blue eyes. She was 10 years old, small for her age, but carrying herself with the premature maturity that came from understanding adult struggles too early. Her resemblance to Marcus was undeniable. The same bone structure, the same analytical expression, the same piercing gaze that seemed to see through surface appearances to underlying truths. "Mom," Emma said, dropping her backpack by the door. "Who is this man?" The question hung in the air while Maria and Marcus exchanged glances that conveyed years of unspoken complexity. Emma had obviously inherited her father's intelligence, her young mind already processing the significance of a wealthy stranger's presence in their modest apartment. "Emma," Maria said carefully, "this is Marcus Blackwood. He's your father." Emma studied Marcus with the same intensity that had frozen him at the press conference. Her young mind was clearly processing this information, comparing it against whatever Maria had told her about her absent father, measuring the reality against expectations she had developed over 10 years of wondering. "You're the man who's going to demolish our building," Emma said with matter-of-fact directness that cut through any pretense. "Lily Chen from school said her mom saw your picture in the newspaper. You're going to make us homeless." The accusation landed with crushing impact. Marcus was indeed planning to demolish Building 4, along with the rest of Riverside Gardens. Emma's home, the only stability she had ever known, was scheduled for destruction in his pursuit of maximum development profit. He had come here seeking answers about a daughter he never knew existed, only to discover that his business decisions were about to destroy her life. Marcus looked around the apartment with new eyes, seeing not a development opportunity, but a home where his daughter had taken her first steps, spoken her first words, celebrated 10 birthdays without her father's presence. The family photographs showed Emma's progression from infant to child, marking milestones he had missed while focusing on accumulating wealth that seemed meaningless in comparison. "Emma," Marcus said, his voice barely steady, "I didn't know you existed. If I had known, everything would have been different." Emma's expression remained skeptical, her young intelligence recognizing empty promises when she heard them. "Would it have been different?" she asked, "or would you still have chosen money over people?" The question struck at the heart of Marcus's entire life philosophy. His pursuit of success had been driven by a determination never to be powerless again, never to face the helplessness his own family had experienced when developers destroyed their neighborhood. Yet here he was, wielding that same power against his own daughter, perpetuating the cycle he had sworn to escape. "I need to understand everything," Marcus said, looking between Maria and Emma. "How you've been living, what you need, how I can help fix this situation." "You can start by not destroying our home," Emma replied with her father's directness, "and by understanding that fixing things isn't just about money, it's about being present for the life you've already missed." Marcus spent the next hour listening to Emma's stories about school, her friends in the building, her dreams of becoming a doctor like her mother had planned to be before circumstances intervened. Each detail revealed a life rich with relationships and experiences that his wealth couldn't replicate or replace. Maria showed him Emma's report cards, all excellent grades, despite the financial stress that had defined their household. Emma had inherited her father's analytical mind, but applied it to understanding people rather than exploiting them. She tutored younger children in the building, organized community cleanup efforts, and had somehow maintained optimism despite growing up with uncertainty. The irony was devastating. Marcus had spent 15 years building an empire designed to provide security and power, while his daughter had grown up embodying the values he had abandoned in pursuit of success. She understood community in ways that his corporate achievements never could, found meaning in relationships that his wealth couldn't purchase. As evening approached, Marcus realized he faced a choice that would define not just his future, but his understanding of everything his life had been building toward. The Riverside Gardens acquisition represented months of planning and millions in potential profit. Walking away would signal weakness to competitors and investors who measured success solely through financial metrics. Yet continuing with the demolition would destroy his daughter's home and community, displacing her friends and neighbors while enriching him further with money he didn't need. The success he had pursued so relentlessly had brought him to a moment where it threatened to destroy the only thing that truly mattered. Emma had returned to her homework at the kitchen table, her concentration absolute despite the life-changing conversation occurring around her. She possessed the same focus that had driven Marcus's business success, but she applied it to learning and growing rather than accumulating and controlling. Marcus studied his daughter's profile as she worked, seeing his own features reflected in her face, but transformed by Maria's kindness and the community's influence. Emma was who he might have become if his circumstances had been different, if his response to powerlessness had been connection rather than domination. The weight of 15 years of absence pressed down on him with crushing force. Birthday parties he had missed, school plays he had never attended, bedtime stories he had never read, scraped knees he had never comforted. Emma had grown up without a father's guidance or support, yet she had somehow developed into everything he had lost while pursuing success. "Mr. Blackwood," Emma said without looking up from her homework, "are you going to stay for dinner? Mom makes really good rice and beans, and there's always enough for one more person." The simple invitation contained more warmth than Marcus had experienced in years of corporate dinners and business entertainment. Emma was offering to share what little they had, extending hospitality despite knowing he was the man planning to destroy her home. Marcus accepted the invitation, finding himself seated at a small kitchen table that had hosted years of family. Meals, homework sessions, and quiet conversations between mother and daughter. The food was simple but prepared with care, seasoned with love rather than expensive ingredients. During dinner, Emma talked about her school friends, many of whom lived in Riverside Gardens and faced the same uncertain future. She described Mrs. Patterson in 3A, who had lived in the building for 40 years, raising 3 generations of her family in the same apartment. She mentioned Carlos in 2C, who was saving money to bring his elderly parents from Puerto Rico to live with his family. Each story revealed the human cost of Marcus's business decision. These weren't statistics or obstacles to be overcome, but real people with deep roots and legitimate claims to stability. His daughter's community was built on relationships that his development plan would sever forever. After dinner, Emma showed Marcus her room, a small space she had transformed into a sanctuary with drawings on the walls, books stacked carefully on makeshift shelves, and a window that looked out over the courtyard where children played each evening. Her artwork displayed remarkable talent, capturing scenes of neighborhood life with detail that revealed careful observation and genuine affection for her surroundings. This drawing shows Mrs. Patterson teaching kids how to garden in the courtyard. Emma explained, pointing to a watercolor that captured an elderly woman surrounded by children learning to plant seeds. And this one shows the block party we had last summer, when everyone brought food and we set up tables in the street. The artwork revealed a community Marcus had never bothered to see during his site surveys and financial analyses. He had reduced Riverside Gardens to square footage and profit margins, failing to recognize the human ecosystem that had developed over decades of shared experiences and mutual support. Emma's bookshelf contained advanced reading material that suggested intellectual curiosity far beyond her age. She had checked out college-level texts about urban planning and architecture, studying the forces that shaped neighborhoods like her own. Her young mind was already grappling with questions about development and community that Marcus had stopped asking years ago. "I want to understand how cities work," Emma explained when she noticed his surprise at her reading choices. "Why some neighborhoods get improved while others get destroyed. Why some people have choices while others have to accept what happens to them." The questions cut to the heart of Marcus's business model. His success depended on exploiting power imbalances, acquiring properties from those who lacked resources, to resist while developing them for those who could afford premium prices. Emma was studying the very systems he had mastered, but from the perspective of those who suffered their consequences. As the evening progressed, Marcus found himself drawn into conversations with other residents who stopped by to visit Maria and Emma. The building operated as an extended family, with neighbors sharing resources, watching each other's children, and providing support during difficult times. The community Emma had grown up in possessed social wealth that Marcus's financial wealth couldn't replicate. Mrs. Patterson arrived with homemade cookies, expressing concern about Emma's schoolwork and offering tutoring help. Carlos stopped by to fix a leaky faucet in Maria's kitchen, refusing payment beyond a cup of coffee and conversation. A teenage girl from downstairs brought homework questions for Emma's help, part of an informal tutoring network that had developed among the children. Each interaction revealed relationships built on reciprocity and genuine care rather than financial transactions. Marcus watched his daughter navigate these connections with ease, giving and receiving support as naturally as breathing. She had grown up in a world where people mattered more than profit, where community strength was measured by mutual aid rather than individual accumulation. The contrast with his own social circles was stark. Marcus's relationships were primarily transactional, built on shared interests in wealth accumulation and power concentration. His business associates would abandon him without hesitation if his success faltered, and his social connections were maintained through expensive entertainment rather than genuine friendship. As the evening wound down, Marcus faced the reality that he would need to leave soon, returning to his penthouse apartment and the decision that awaited him. The Riverside Gardens contract sat on his office desk, requiring only his signature to finalize the acquisition and begin the displacement process that would destroy his daughter's community. Emma seemed to sense his internal struggle, approaching him with the directness that characterized her personality. "You could choose differently," she said simply. "You have enough money already. You could choose to help people instead of hurting them." The statement contained wisdom that Marcus's expensive education and business experience had failed to provide. Emma understood something fundamental that he had forgotten in his pursuit of success. Wealth was meaningless unless it served purposes beyond accumulation, and power was worthless unless it protected rather than exploited vulnerability. Marcus left Riverside Gardens with his entire worldview fracturing around him. The drive back to his penthouse passed in silence as he processed the implications of everything he had learned. Emma was his daughter, brilliant and compassionate, growing up in poverty while he accumulated wealth that could transform her life. Yet the very system that had generated his wealth was now threatening to destroy the community that had shaped her character. His penthouse felt emptier than ever. When he arrived, its expensive furnishings and panoramic views suddenly seeming like monuments to misplaced priorities. The contracts for Riverside Gardens waited on his desk, surrounded by financial projections that quantified profit margins but ignored human costs. Marcus stood at his floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the city he had spent 15 years reshaping through strategic development. Each building in his portfolio represented families displaced, communities scattered, neighborhoods transformed to serve wealth rather than residents. He had become the very force that had destroyed his own family's stability decades ago. The year's recognition was devastating. In fleeing powerlessness, Marcus had become the source of powerlessness for others. His daughter was growing up experiencing the same uncertainty he had sworn to escape, while his success accelerated the very problems he had once sought to solve. But Emma's words echoed in his mind with growing force. You could choose differently. The simple statement contained revolutionary implications for everything Marcus had built and everything he had planned to accomplish. Different choices would require different priorities, different measures of success, different relationships with the communities his decisions affected. Marcus spent the night staring at the Riverside Gardens contracts, understanding that his signature would represent more than a business transaction. It would determine whether he remained the man who had abandoned his daughter or became the father she deserved. Whether he continued perpetuating the systems that had separated them, or began using his power to protect rather than exploit the vulnerable. Dawn broke over Manhattan with Marcus still seated at his desk, the unsigned contracts before him representing a crossroads that would define not just his future, but his understanding of what success actually meant. Emma's face remained vivid. In his memory, her intelligence and compassion serving as a mirror that reflected everything he had lost while pursuing everything he thought he wanted. The choice was his to make, but for the first time in 15 years, Marcus understood that the right choice might require abandoning everything he had worked to achieve. The morning sunlight streaming through Marcus's penthouse windows felt different somehow, carrying weight that seemed to press against the glass like an accusation. He had spent the entire night wrestling with a decision that would define everything moving forward. The unsigned Riverside Gardens contracts spread across his mahogany desk like evidence of a crime he hadn't yet committed but was still contemplating. His phone had been ringing constantly since yesterday's abrupt departure from the press conference. Diana, his sister and CFO, had left increasingly urgent voicemails demanding explanations for his behavior and insisting that investors were beginning to question his reliability. The board of directors had scheduled an emergency meeting to address what they were calling his unprecedented lack of professionalism in abandoning a major announcement. Marcus ignored them all, his attention focused entirely on the choice. Before him, sign the contracts and proceed with the demolition that would destroy his daughter's home while generating millions in profit, or walk away from months of planning and face the professional consequences of what others would see as inexplicable weakness. The decision should have been simple. Business was business. and personal considerations couldn't be allowed to interfere with fiduciary responsibilities to shareholders and investors. Marcus had built his empire on exactly this kind of disciplined separation between emotion and strategy, never allowing sentiment to compromise profit potential. Yet Emma's face haunted him, her intelligent eyes reflecting disappointment that got deeper than any business failure could. She had asked him to choose differently, to use his wealth and power to help rather than harm. The request seemed impossible within the framework of everything Marcus had spent 15 years building, yet it also seemed like the only choice that mattered. A soft knock interrupted his contemplation. Sarah entered with her usual efficiency, carrying the morning briefings that typically structured his day around meetings, calls, and strategic decisions that moved millions of dollars between accounts with clinical precision. "Mr. Blackwood," she began hesitantly, "the investors from the Nakamura Group are requesting immediate clarification about yesterday's events. They're concerned that the Riverside Gardens acquisition might be compromised, which could affect their willingness to proceed with the larger development partnership." Marcus studied Sarah's face, recognizing genuine worry beneath her professional composure. She had worked for him for 8 years, managing the details that allowed him to focus on high-level strategy and long-term planning. Her career was tied to his success, and his recent behavior threatened the stability she had built around serving his interests. "Tell them the acquisition is under review," Marcus replied, surprising himself with words he hadn't planned to speak. "All contracts are on hold, pending further analysis of community impact and alternative development strategies." Sarah's eyes widened with confusion and concern. "Sir, community impact hasn't been a consideration in previous acquisitions. The legal and financial teams have already completed all required assessments. The contracts are ready for your signature." The response revealed how completely Marcus had trained his organization to ignore human costs in favor of regulatory compliance and profit maximization. Community impact was measured only in terms of legal requirements and public relations management, not actual effects on real people's lives. "Cancel my meetings for today," Marcus continued, his decision crystallizing as he spoke. "I need to conduct additional due diligence on this project before proceeding." After Sarah left, clearly troubled by his unprecedented behavior, Marcus retrieved his phone and dialed a number he had memorized during the sleepless night. Maria answered on the second ring, her voice cautious but hopeful. "Maria, it's Marcus. I've been thinking about everything we discussed yesterday, and I need to understand more about the community I'm planning to affect. Would it be possible for me to spend time at Riverside Gardens today, meeting the families who live there?" The request obviously surprised her. "You want to meet your tenants before you evict them?" "I want to meet the people whose lives my decision will change," Marcus corrected. "If I'm going to proceed with this acquisition, I need to understand the full impact of what that means." Maria agreed to introduce him to other residents, though her tone suggested skepticism about his motivations. Marcus understood her wariness. From her perspective, he was the wealthy developer who had abandoned her and their daughter, now potentially conducting a superficial gesture before destroying their community anyway. Marcus dressed carefully for his return to Riverside Gardens, choosing clothes that wouldn't immediately identify him as someone from a different economic class. The gesture felt hollow. His expensive watch alone probably cost more than most residents' monthly income. But he didn't want to emphasize the wealth gap that separated him from his daughter's world. The drive through Manhattan took him past dozens of his previous acquisitions, buildings he had purchased, demolished, and redeveloped over the years. Each project had followed the same pattern: identify undervalued properties, pressure current owners through legal and financial mechanisms, acquire below market value, and maximize profit through luxury redevelopment. For the first time, Marcus found himself wondering about the human stories behind those transactions. How many families had been displaced by his success? How many communities had been scattered to make room for developments that served wealthy buyers while destroying established neighborhoods? The questions felt dangerous because they threatened the fundamental logic that had driven his career. If he acknowledged the human cost of his business model, how could he continue operating within it? Yet if he ignored those costs, how could he face his daughter knowing that her community was just another profit opportunity? Riverside Gardens appeared before him, its red brick buildings standing solid against the morning sky, despite their obvious age and the deferred maintenance that Marcus's acquisition strategy had deliberately encouraged. Children played in the courtyard, their laughter carrying across the space with innocent joy that seemed oblivious to the uncertainty hanging over their homes. Maria met him at Building 4's entrance, her expression guarded but civil. She had obviously spent time considering how to handle his sudden interest in the community he was planning to destroy. "Before we visit anyone," she said, "you need to understand something important. These people have been living with the threat of displacement for 2 years. Your company has been pressuring the management company, delaying repairs, and making life difficult for residents in ways that might not show up in your legal documents but affect daily life constantly." The accusation stung because Marcus recognized its accuracy. His acquisition strategy had included systematic pressure designed to reduce property values and weaken tenant resistance. He had authorized tactics that made life difficult for residents, calculating that inconvenience would encourage voluntary departures that simplified the eventual redevelopment process. "I need to understand what that pressure has looked like. From your perspective," Marcus admitted, "how my business decisions have affected real people's lives." Maria led him through the building, introducing him to residents who had been dealing with the consequences of his strategic decisions for months. Mrs. Patterson in 3A showed him the kitchen window that had been broken for 6 months, with management claiming repairs were delayed pending building inspections that never seemed to be completed. Carlos from 2C explained how his requests for heat repairs had been ignored through the previous winter, forcing his family to use space heaters that increased their electric bills beyond what they could afford. The delay in repairs was strategic, designed to encourage tenant departures, but it had subjected Carlos's elderly mother to dangerous cold that exacerbated her arthritis. Each conversation revealed the human impact of decisions Marcus had made, from boardrooms and conference calls, viewing properties as assets rather than homes. The strategic pressure he had authorized had real faces now, real families struggling, with problems he had deliberately created to serve his acquisition timeline. In apartment 5B, he met the Chen family, whose daughter Lily attended school with Emma. Mrs. Chen worked 3 jobs to afford the rent, while her husband recovered from an injury that had eliminated his construction income. The family had been saving for 2 years to move to a better apartment, but the threat of displacement had forced them to spend those savings on temporary housing deposits and application fees for apartments they ultimately couldn't afford. The systematic destruction of stability became clear as Marcus listened to story after story of families whose lives had been disrupted by his business strategy. He had created a climate of uncertainty that forced people to make desperate decisions, spending resources they didn't have to secure housing they might not be able to keep. Young Tommy Rodriguez from 1C, only 8 years old, had been having nightmares about becoming homeless ever since his parents explained that their building might be demolished. His anxiety had affected his schoolwork and social relationships, creating problems that would follow him regardless of where his family eventually relocated. The human cost was multiplying beyond the immediate displacement. Children were suffering psychological trauma, elderly residents were facing health crises, working families were being pushed into financial desperation, and an entire community was being systematically destroyed through deliberate pressure that Marcus had authorized without considering its actual impact on real people. Emma found him during lunch break from school, her presence bringing both comfort and judgment that Marcus struggled to process. She had been living with this uncertainty for 2 years, watching her friends' families prepare for displacement while wondering when her own family would be forced to leave the only home she had ever known. "Dad," she said, using the title naturally. "Despite their brief acquaintance, Mrs. Patterson wants to show you the community garden we built on the roof. She says, if you're going to demolish our building, you should at least see what you're destroying." The roof garden was a revelation that shattered Marcus's assumptions about urban housing and community development. Residents had transformed unused space into a productive garden that supplied fresh vegetables for families throughout the building. Mrs. Patterson had organized the effort, sharing decades of gardening knowledge with neighbors who had never imagined they could grow their own food in the middle of Manhattan. The garden represented exactly the kind of community initiative that Marcus's redevelopment plan would eliminate. His luxury towers would feature professionally maintained landscaping that required no resident involvement and provided no practical benefit beyond aesthetic appeal for wealthy buyers who could afford to purchase fresh organic produce without consideration of cost. Emma led him between raised beds where tomatoes, peppers, and herbs grew under careful tending by residents who had invested time and hope in creating something beautiful and useful despite the uncertainty surrounding their future. Children learned, alongside adults, understanding where food came from and developing skills that connected them to the natural world despite their urban environment. "This garden feeds 12 families every summer," Emma explained with pride. "Mrs. Patterson taught us how to save seeds so we can plant again next year. And Mr. Rodriguez built these raised beds from recycled materials. Everyone contributes work, and everyone shares the harvest." The garden embodied values that Marcus had lost during his pursuit of financial success. Collaboration rather than competition, shared benefit rather than individual accumulation, investment in community rather than exploitation of opportunity. Emma had grown up within these values, learning lessons about interdependence and mutual support that his wealth couldn't purchase. Marcus spent the afternoon helping with garden maintenance, his expensive clothes becoming dirty as he worked alongside residents who accepted his presence with cautious politeness. The physical labor felt foreign after years of conducting business through phone calls and meetings, but it also felt real in ways that corporate success had stopped providing. As evening approached, the building's children gathered in the courtyard for an informal soccer game that had apparently been a daily tradition for years. Emma joined enthusiastically, her laughter mixing with her friends' voices in a symphony of childhood joy that seemed impossible to replicate in the isolated luxury developments Marcus typically created. Watching his daughter play with children who might be scattered across the city if his acquisition proceeded, Marcus felt the full weight of his responsibility settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. These weren't statistics or obstacles to overcome. They were Emma's friends, her community, the people who had helped raise her while he remained absent and oblivious. Diana arrived unexpectedly as the children's game was winding down, her presence immediately changing the atmosphere from relaxed community interaction to tense corporate confrontation. She had obviously tracked him down through GPS monitoring of his company car, determined to force the conversation he had been avoiding about his unprecedented behavior. "Marcus, what exactly are you doing here?" she demanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to immediate answers and swift resolution of problems that interfered with business objectives. Emma looked up from her soccer ball, studying the expensively dressed woman whose aggressive presence seemed to threaten the community harmony she had been enjoying. Diana represented everything unfamiliar and intimidating about her father's world. The corporate power that treated people as obstacles to be overcome rather than individuals deserving consideration. "Diana," Marcus said carefully, "I'd like you to meet Emma, my daughter." The statement hit Diana like a physical blow, her composed corporate facade cracking as she processed information that threatened everything she had built around controlling Marcus's decision-making and business focus. A daughter represented emotional complications that could compromise the profitable isolation she had helped him maintain. "Your daughter," Diana repeated, her voice betraying shock that quickly transformed into calculation. "Marcus, we need to discuss this privately. There are legal implications, financial considerations, and public relations concerns that require immediate attention." The corporate response revealed how completely Diana viewed human relationships through the lens of business impact and risk management. Emma wasn't a person with legitimate claims on Marcus's attention and affection. She was a potential liability requiring strategic management to minimize damage to business objectives. Emma stepped closer to Marcus, her young intelligence recognizing threat despite not understanding the specific dangers Diana represented. Her father had arrived in her life only yesterday, but she could sense that this woman's presence might eliminate him again before their relationship had a chance to develop. Marcus felt torn between worlds that seemed impossible to reconcile. Diana was right about the business implications. Acknowledging Emma would create legal obligations, financial responsibilities, and emotional complications that could compromise his ability to maintain the corporate focus that had generated his success. Yet looking at his daughter's face, seeing intelligence and hope and vulnerability that his wealth could protect rather than exploit, Marcus realized that business considerations had stopped mattering in any meaningful way. Emma's existence had revealed the emptiness of everything else he had pursued, showing him possibilities for meaning that corporate success had never provided. "Diana," Marcus said firmly, "Emma is my daughter, and Riverside Gardens is her home. I'm not signing the acquisition contracts." The statement shocked Diana into momentary silence, her mind clearly racing through the implications of a decision that would unravel months of planning while setting a precedent that could affect every future acquisition. Marcus had never allowed personal considerations to compromise business objectives, and this sudden change threatened the entire framework of their professional relationship. "Marcus, you're not thinking clearly," Diana said, her voice taking on the patient tone she used when managing his occasional doubts about particularly aggressive business strategies. "This is an emotional reaction to an unexpected situation. We can discuss appropriate support for the child without compromising a major business opportunity." The dismissive reference to Emma as the child rather than his daughter revealed Diana's fundamental inability to recognize human value that couldn't be quantified in financial terms. She was offering to manage the complication rather than encouraging him to embrace the relationship, viewing Emma as a problem, requiring minimal resources rather than a person deserving maximum love. Emma watched this exchange with growing understanding of the forces that had kept her father absent from her life. Diana represented a world that measured value only through money and power, that treated relationships as obstacles to efficiency rather than sources of meaning and purpose. "Dad," Emma said quietly, "you don't have to choose between helping us and being successful. You could use your success to help people instead of hurting them. You could build things that make communities stronger instead of tearing them apart." The simple suggestion contained revolutionary implications for everything Marcus had built his career around. Emma was proposing a fundamental redefinition of success that prioritized community benefit over individual accumulation, that measured achievement through positive impact rather than maximum profit. Diana's expression revealed her horror at the dangerous ideas Emma was introducing to Marcus's thinking. Community benefit was acceptable as a public relations strategy or tax deduction opportunity, but never as a primary business objective that might compromise profit maximization. "Marcus," Diana said urgently, "we have fiduciary responsibilities to shareholders and investors who have committed resources based on our track record of profitable development. We cannot allow emotional considerations to override business judgment." The appeal to fiduciary duty represented Diana's strongest argument, invoking legal and ethical obligations that had justified every previous decision to prioritize profit over people. Marcus had spent 15 years accepting this logic, believing that serving shareholder interests absolved him of responsibility for broader community impact. Yet looking at Emma, understanding that his business success had created the very problems his daughter was facing, Marcus realized that fiduciary duty might extend beyond shareholders to include the communities affected by corporate decisions. Perhaps he had obligations to people like Emma that transcended profit maximization. "I'm withdrawing the Riverside Gardens acquisition," Marcus announced, his decision crystallizing into absolute certainty. "We're going to explore alternative development, strategies that strengthen communities rather than destroying them." Diana's face cycled through shock, anger, and calculation as she processed the implications of a decision that would require extensive explanation to investors and potentially damage Marcus's reputation for profitable ruthlessness that had attracted their confidence. "This is career suicide, Marcus," she said bluntly. "You'll be seen as weak, unreliable, subject to emotional manipulation that compromises business judgment. Investors will lose confidence, competitors will sense vulnerability, and everything you've built will be at risk." The warnings were probably accurate, Marcus realized. His sudden change in priorities would indeed signal weakness to people who measured success solely through financial accumulation and competitive dominance. He might lose investors, face legal challenges, and suffer professional consequences that would affect his ability to maintain the wealth and power he had spent 15 years accumulating. But watching Emma's face light up with hope and relief, seeing the joy that spread through the courtyard as children realized their homes might be safe, Marcus understood that those consequences were acceptable prices to pay for becoming the father and person he should have been all along. Over the following months, Marcus discovered that redefining success was more complicated than simply changing business objectives. Withdrawing from the Riverside Gardens acquisition cost him millions in development fees and legal penalties, while his reputation for profitable ruthlessness began attracting different kinds of attention from competitors who sensed vulnerability. However, the process of learning to be Emma's father provided rewards that financial success had never delivered, helping with homework, attending school events, reading bedtime stories, and simply being present for daily moments that had previously been invisible to him, created meaning that made corporate achievements seem hollow in comparison. Marcus began restructuring Blackwood Industries around community development rather than community displacement, using his resources to renovate existing housing rather than demolishing it for luxury redevelopment. The transition was expensive and complex, requiring new relationships with contractors, architects, and city planners who shared his evolving vision of development that strengthened rather than scattered communities. Emma became his most trusted advisor on community impact, her intelligence and understanding of neighborhood dynamics providing insights that his expensive consultants had never offered. She helped him recognize opportunities to improve housing while preserving affordability, to create economic development that benefited existing residents rather than displacing them. The financial returns were lower than his previous aggressive acquisition strategy had generated. But Marcus discovered that enough money was actually enough when it served purposes beyond accumulation. His wealth could provide security and opportunity for Emma, while supporting community development that created value for hundreds of families rather than dozens of wealthy buyers. Diana eventually left Blackwood Industries, unable to adapt to business priorities that prioritized community benefit over maximum profit. Her departure was painful but necessary, representing Marcus's final break with the corporate mindset that had shaped his career while keeping him isolated from meaningful relationships. 6 months after the press conference that had changed everything, Marcus stood in the Riverside Gardens courtyard, watching Emma play with friends whose homes were now secure thanks to his decision to preserve rather than demolish their community. The buildings had been renovated rather than replaced, their structural integrity improved, while maintaining the affordable rents that allowed working families to remain in Manhattan. The rooftop garden had expanded into a community center where residents offered classes in everything from financial planning to computer skills, creating educational opportunities that strengthened the community's economic stability while building social connections that transcended individual apartments. Emma approached him with a school assignment she was particularly proud of, an essay about urban development that demonstrated understanding of complex issues that most adults never considered. Her writing revealed analytical skills inherited from her father, but applied to questions of social justice and community empowerment that his education had never addressed. "Dad," she said, using the title that still filled Marcus with gratitude and wonder, "my teacher wants to invite you to speak to our class about responsible development. She thinks other kids should learn about choosing to help instead of hurt." The invitation represented recognition that Marcus had successfully transformed from someone who exploited communities into someone who strengthened them. Emma's pride in his evolution was worth more than any corporate award or financial milestone he had previously achieved. Looking around the courtyard where children played safely while their parents worked and planned for futures that no longer included the threat of displacement, Marcus understood that real success was measured not by individual accumulation, but by community flourishing. His wealth had finally found its proper purpose, serving love rather than isolation, building rather than destroying, creating rather than consuming. Emma's laughter echoed across the courtyard, mixing with her friends, voices in a symphony of childhood joy that would continue long after Marcus was gone. His legacy would live in the communities he had chosen to strengthen rather than scatter, in the relationships he had prioritized over profit, and in the daughter who had taught him that the most important acquisitions couldn't be purchased but only earned through presence, love, and the courage to choose differently. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.